Blah, 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 blah. Hey guys, I'm your host Gabe, and welcome back to Redmond Radio, week 3 of Pride Month. Now, if my voice sounds a little different, that's because that first part is a lie. I'm actually Jesse. I usually write the scripts and stuff for the episodes, but for today, I'm going to be a host. It's pretty cool. This episode, our guest will be Mr. Manuel, who will be sharing with us the history of gay rights and the gay rights movement, and will also be answering a few questions about his experience being gay. Now, if you want any more information on the gay rights movement, I'll be putting some links in the description for articles you can read to get more information and stuff. So yeah, I think that's pretty good.
Oh, okay. So can you tell me, yeah, what is this that you guys are doing? And because you guys are
So
it's for leadership, but you're doing this over the summer?
so you know how each month has like an awareness thing connected to it.
Yeah, sure.
So what we're doing for leadership is doing a podcast for each month,
Okay.
highlights whatever that month's supposed to bring light to.
Okay.
So last month we did a mental health awareness. It was mental health awareness
Okay.
month. This month we're doing Pride Month.
Okay. Gotcha. Um, and well, that's cool. And so you guys are doing it every month. So you guys still doing this in something for July and August also?
I guess yeah.
Okay. And then when
So throughout the year.
where are you guys like producing it or um like where can you listen to it?
Are we I didn't hear that last part.
Where is it being produced at, or where is it like available to listen to? Are your past episodes like
It's on our past episodes are on YouTube under Redmond Radio. I can put a link in the description in the chat.
okay, cool.
Do that right now.
uh,
I believe this is our 4th episode.
okay, that's cool. Is it not out on like podcast apps yet, or you can't produce it that way yet?
We can't produce it that way yet. We're planning on
And
doing that eventually, but so
oh,
far we can't.
okay, I'm ready, so whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hello listeners. Welcome back to Redmond Radio. I'm your host Jesse. You're being met with Mr. Manuel. Would you like to say a bit about yourself?
Sure. My name's Marco Manuel. I teach at Redmond Middle School, and I'm super pumped to do this. I don't know, lesson interview with you today.
That's cool. Great. So, would you like to share a bit about the history of uh, LGBTQ rights, the movement, and whatnot? Pride
Uh,
Month.
I can kind of just talk through some of like the lessons that I did for my class. Is that cool?
Yeah, that's cool.
Okay. Then yeah, I'm just gonna talk through some of the stuff that I taught in my middle school classes, and at any point, if you want to, you can like interrupt me, and then I don't know for more clarification. Or sometimes I just talk really fast, and yeah, just feel free to interrupt me if I don't know you feel like I'm I don't know way out there sometimes. All right.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Um, okay, so I teach eighth grade U.S. history, and at the end of the school year, we usually end with our civil rights unit, and so part of that unit involves talking about LGBTQ history and civil rights movements and such. And so, 2019 was the first year that I actually taught this lesson in school, and which was actually the year that Jesse was in my class. and
Yeah. Oh,
and so this year is the second year that I taught this lesson, and just even for me teaching this lesson all like by itself is sort of kind of an act and like representation of progress, I think, in public school, because
yeah, definitely.
when I was younger, we definitely did not talk about anything gay. We didn't talk about in school. We didn't do it. Um, so, and I don't know, Jesse, do you remember me last year teaching that lesson? Like, being kind of nervous or awkward doing it?
I mean, yeah, it was different. I feel like it was a different experience for a lot of us because I found that was the first time it was actually taught at school. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And this year, when I did it too, I got a lot of feedback from students kind of saying that they were surprised, and also most of them like having like positively saying like they were thankful that I was teaching this lesson, um,
yeah.
just because it's kind of different. So, uh, all right, well, I'll jump in and then again, yeah, interrupt me wherever you feel like you should.
Will do.
So when I started this lesson, I asked students like, what kind of questions do you guys want to know? And so some of the honest questions I got is how I based the lesson, and so I'm going to kind of run through and talk through some of those things. So the first thing that, I mean, maybe it's obvious, but maybe it's not, that we should talk about is just like the vocabulary, like LGBTQ and the whole like alphabet. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the alphabet, but L is lesbian and gay, or G is gay, B is bisexual, and then T is transgender, and Q is queer. And transgender, it's kind of actually like a where a lot of focus is right now. And a transgender person, like people sometimes might be confused as to what should you call them. And so and maybe some people think that it's maybe strange or they're uncomfortable with the concept of transgenderness. And so I'll circle back around to this at the end, is call anybody whatever pronoun they want to be called. And a transgender woman is somebody that was born a male and then transitioned into a woman, and a transgender man is somebody who was born a female and then transitioned into a man. So you use whatever pronoun the second part is. And the Q, the queer word, is kind of one of those words that became reclaimed like through history. It used to be, one of those derogatory words that you call somebody queer because you want to make fun of them. And now that word queer is kind of generally like an own word. And queer is a really useful word. If you don't know what to call someone, you can call them queer. And it's kind of like this all encompassing, like potentially gender non-conforming and or homosexual, bisexual. It's sort of a catch-all kind of word. And
Yeah.
so
I know.
oh yeah, go for it.
I know. I'm guessing this was like pretty recent because like if you still look in dictionaries and stuff, don't
Mm-hmm.
really talk about that definition of queer. It's still the odd
Oh yeah.
meaning.
Yeah, and so like the word queer literally, yeah, it just means sort of like odd or different, or maybe you might say something like it's like an old English word, I think, like, oh well, that looks really queer over there. And it's just like how we would use the word weird.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of, yeah. And now there's different letters of the alphabet that represent different things. And I don't know, the alphabet is not one of those things that I feel super passionately about. I know that there are parts of the community that do, and they feel like really passionate about it. But
Mm.
I think a big part of any conversation that you have with anyone is all about the intention that you have. And if you honestly don't know, you can ask. And a lot of times people are pretty patient as long as you are being genuine and you're not trying to like be mean.
Yeah.
So that's first thing to get out of the way. And then a lot of times too, when I'm talking, I will just say gay as a kind of word that I'm applying across all like gay rights, gay history, just because LGBTQ is kind of a mouthful. So I usually just say gay because it's short and sweet and it gets the point across. So that's what I mean when I say gay. All right. So then one of the other questions that I thought was good from Jesse's class that I got from students was, who was the first gay? And somebody asked, were the Greeks really gay? And So I actually I didn't know some of these things, so actually I had to do a little bit of research. And so I actually found some information like the first like recorded gays in history, apparently anyway, are these Egyptian servants from 2450 BC, and they're like these royal servants, and I didn't write down their names of course, but they're like buried together,
Mm.
and they're kind of history's first recorded that somebody wrote down about that. Oh, like there's a couple gay guys, and they were revered in the royal family, and they got to be buried and mummified together, I guess. Um,
It's pretty
and
cool.
then the other point that I wanted to make is that like homosexuality has been around forever and in multiple parts of the ancient world. So somebody asked, like, were the Greeks really gay? And so, like, a fun fact is Alexander the Great that you guys learned about, I think, in sixth grade, ancient world
Yeah.
history. And he was like, maybe they didn't call it gay, but it just wasn't a big deal. But he was definitely kind of a famous homosexual in history. He led the world's largest empire at the time for, I don't know, a couple decades, and then he died. But yeah, he was kind of a famous homo. Um, and other parts of the ancient world too kind of thought differently about it. So certain Greek city states, they were indifferent, they didn't think it was a big deal, while in other certain Greek city states they were like might have condemned it, and it wasn't I don't know, widely accepted. But then in the Roman Empire, which lasted for like over 1,000 years, they were pretty open and accepting to it. Like in Roman society, for across most of the empire, it wasn't a big deal. It just like it didn't really come up, and so uh, ancient civilizations or cultures like kind of condemning homosexuality only kind of come with the development of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim societies that happened kind of later. And so then, why do people why are they against it if it was kind of widely accepted? So, like I said, in the ancient world, it was kind of widely accepted, and through probably most of history, it was, unless you were in one of those kind of highly religious societies that the Christian world kind of ended up dominating, and then the Muslim world also took over quite a chunk of territory in the world. But otherwise, if you weren't in one of those societies, it wasn't that big of a deal. So then, why do people end up being against them? So the spread of monotheism starts influencing like a negative attitude kind of towards homosexuality. And then
Yeah.
in, let's see what I got here. 1533 in England is the first actual written law. So up until 1533, it's kind of frowned upon. We know that the Catholic Church or the Christian Church, they're not super happy about it. It's in biblical uh, scripture and things, but it's not actually part of the government law until you see that in 1533 in England, where there's a law that says, let's see, the abominable vice of buggery is made punishable by hanging. And so, yeah, buggery is their fancy or nice word for don't be gay, don't do gay things, or we're going to hang you. And so then more kind of anti-gay laws, they get passed through different societies, and they carry over into like colonial America. So when the people show up in the 13 colonies, you can have those don't be gay kind of laws too. And then gay or homosexuality kind of gets a negative stereotype. And let's see, there's this Dr. Frank Lydston in 1889, who is, I believe this is in the United States in 1889. He says, there is in every community of any size a colony of male sexual perverts known to each other, likely to congregate together and characterized by effeminacy of voice, dress, and manner. And so in this, he's just kind of wanting to make anybody who might be of a homosexual nature make them sound bad. So kind of throughout history, there's just sort of this culture and repetition that people start to believe, to think negatively and have and develop like this prejudice against homosexuality that um, that starts and then persists, and then up until later 1900s is it's just homosexuality is kindly like looked down upon. Um, so when and how does acceptance sort of start? So you've got, it's not a big deal for most of world history. Then the last 2,000 years or so, people start to care about it. And then in the last 100 years or so, things kind of start to change again a little bit. So acceptance is really slow, and there's a couple of people who start arguing, like later 1800s, that homosexuality is maybe not their fault. So there's this lawyer, Karl Ulrich, in Germany. So he's not American. He's in Germany, and he tries to make this argument for his gay client that says that his client being gay might be a genetic thing, and therefore it shouldn't be punishable because it's not his fault. So he's the first, or again, at least first written history that we know of that somebody has used this as an argument. I don't actually know the outcome of his case, but it's 1879 in Germany, so I'm guessing he probably didn't win his case. I don't know. That's just me making some guesses. Then is 1905, Sigmund Freud, who's kind of the father of psychoanalysis. So people talk about Freud a lot in psychology. And so psychoanalysis is the diagnosing and treating of psychological disorders. And so Freud, he suggests that homosexuality is maybe a result of both hereditary, so it's a result of genetic, and also a combination of environmental life experiences. And so Freud argues too that maybe homosexuality isn't necessarily an individual person's fault. However, because he's Freud and he's the psychoanalysis, which is the diagnosing of disorders, he still thinks that, oh, homosexuality, even though it's not their fault, like other, genetic disorders, it can be fixed. And so starting early on in like 1905, people start to think of homosexuality as a like treatable illness. And so then that opens up like clinical psychologists to try all these different things of like, oh, well, we can fix homosexuality. And they think that they're gonna do this by different kinds of things like shock therapy or aversion therapy or different kinds of like hypnosis or other kinds of psychological treatments to make the gay go away. Or the Christian churches too, a lot of them heavily back within the last 100 years, and even still some of them today, there's still like the whole idea of like pray the gay away camps. Like that is still a thing. And let's see, in 1952, the American Psychiatric Association officially includes homosexuality as a psychological disorder. And in that, so the American Psychiatric Association, they come out with this book of all these, the different ailments that somebody might be suffering from, and then homosexuality makes its way in there. And so now it's a business. Be like, oh, you're gay? Well, cool. We can fix that. It's just going to be, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of dollars worth of treatment. And people do it. But so I just gave you this history, but back in the early 1900s, 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, there's still just generally a culture with a negative outlook on homosexuality. And so there's a couple of researchers that try to disprove or scientifically discredit the idea that homosexuality is like this disorder. And so one of the earliest ones that people, a lot of them, I don't know, they probably don't know about it unless you are a member of the LGBTQ community, is Alfred Kinsey. And Alfred Kinsey, between 1948 and 1953, so he does this over I think like a 4-year period, and he interviews and he gives like these surveys to, I don't know, his sample size is pretty, I don't know, relatively large. I think it's something like 2 or 3 thousand people. And he interviews these people, he gives them the survey, and in the survey he kind of just sort of asks them about their own personal life history, um, and kind of asks them, if you have you ever like thought about a person of the same sex as you, or have you ever like the kissed somebody of the same sex, or I don't know, there's different parts of this survey question. And the results that he finds are that everybody's at least a little bit gay. And I know that that sounds I don't know, maybe triggering for some people to hear, but he develops this thing called the Kinsey scale, and it's a scale of 0 to 6, and the scale is kind of literally a continuum of how gay are you. And so a level 6 is like you are super 100% gay, and then 0 is you are 100% heterosexual. And but what he found is that even people who are still identify as a heterosexual, and maybe still, like they're a man that's married to a woman, or a woman who has been married to a man for, years and years and years, they have still thought or maybe admitted a little bit of having some kind of homosexual like tendency or action. So he finds that this is actually like a common thing for most people. And so he comes up with this thing called this Kinsey scale. And it's still kind of anybody who was LGBTQ thought this was like, oh, this is really great. But in 1953, 1950s America, yeah, that was definitely not getting very much publicity at all. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And then a little bit later, so after 1952, when the Psychiatric Association ascribes homosexuality as this psychological disorder, another clinical psychologist, Evelyn Hooker, and you can look her up. She does this experiment in 1956 where she tries to prove that homosexuality is not a diagnosable disorder. Because if it's a disorder, her understanding, or what it should be, if it's a disorder, you should be able to look at a series of data and look at a pattern of people and how they answer, I don't know, questions, or how they a profile, like how somebody's profile like would look based on data and things, and be able to diagnose them based on that data. So what she wanted to do to disprove this is she found 60 different people who 30 of which identified as homosexual, and 30 of which who identified as heterosexual. And so she takes 60 subjects, and she gives all 60 subjects a whole bunch of different types of tests. One of them being like the famous like ink blot, or like the I think they call them Rorschach tests. So I'm talking about the ink blot test, where it's like it's a blotch.
Yeah.
And like, what do you see? Okay. So she does a bunch of these tests. So one of them is like the ink blot test. Another of them is like this different word association test. Another of them is like some kind of like logic or problem solving. And so anyway, so she gives all the subjects these tests. And so according to the American Psychiatric Association, it is presumed that if you are gay, you will answer, these tests in a particular way, like a gay person would, obviously, because we're clearly all the same. And
Obviously.
so she does this,
Exactly.
and she tracks all these subjects, and then she gives all of the data to a bunch of like a whole team of other psychiatrists, and says, okay, here are 60 subjects. Now, if you know that, your diagnosable gayness, which ones of these are gay and which ones of these are not? And her results find that it's not easy. Like they're usually, they were more often wrong, and even sometimes ascribing the straight or heterosexual subjects as homosexual, and thinking that some of the homosexual subjects were straight. Now, this is still kind of like a subjective test, but still there's people that are trying to disprove this idea. And early on, people are advocating for this. Like in 1924 is the Society for Human Rights, which is the first American gay civil rights group. And then in the 1950s, the Mattachine Society is the first gay advocacy group, and who that is led by this guy named Frank Kameny. Frank Kameny, I didn't fit him into your lesson in 8th grade. Sorry, Jesse. But
It's
Frank
fine.
Kameny, he's kind of an important guy who definitely like led the like homosexuality advocacy movement in the 50s and kind of through the 60s as well. In 1955, there's a lesbian group called the Daughters of Bilitis. But through the 50s and the 60s, these early groups, they didn't want like kind of, they weren't necessarily fighting for like anti-discrimination. What they were sort of fighting for was just acceptance into society. And so these early groups, they were wanting to assimilate. So if you were known to be gay, you were kind of ostracized from your community, and people didn't want to include you. You weren't invited to things. It was big, it's a big shame. Like they didn't want you there. So the
Yeah.
early advocacy groups, they wanted like homosexuals to assimilate and be able to kind of blend into the society that already existed. Because in the 50s and the early 60s is kind of like the height of the stereotypical image of the American dream. So like the family and in the suburbs, and the husband has a job,
Yes.
got a car, and the kids. So the 50s and the 60s is kind of the height of that image of the American dream. And so early
Yeah.
gay advocates, they just sort of wanted homosexuals to be able to kind of participate in that stereotypical American dream. And so
Yeah.
people have been fighting for it for a long time, but there's not that many people. It's not as known about, and it just doesn't really get much attention at all. Like government kind of can ignore it and doesn't really do a lot to recognize the gay community in the 50s and the 60s. Um,
Yeah.
and in the 50s and the 60s too, there's also this kind of propaganda and messaging and marketing that gets put out that still kind of further makes and perpetuates the idea that homosexuality is not a cool thing. Don't be gay. Don't talk to anybody that's gay. And if you do, you're probably gay, and then no one's going to talk to you either. So it was like this big fear campaign. So
Uh,
there's not a lot of progress that gets made. And so that's why when people talk about Stonewall, so I don't know, before our lesson, had you heard about Stonewall before? I don't know. I'm kind of curious.
not before then, but I've done some research like afterwards stuff.
Like since, okay. So a lot of people attribute, the beginning of gay rights to Stonewall, which happens in June of 1969, and so that's why the last weekend in June is kind of usually everybody's Pride weekend, and that's why
Yep.
June is officially like Pride Month, is because the Stonewall uprising, that some people call it, happens in the June of 1969. So um, so up until 1969, the gay community is still kind of thought of as like, whatever, we're not going to give you the time of day, and we just generally don't care about you. And the kind of like motive of advocacy groups is this idea of assimilation, and that all changes in 1969. So throughout the 50s and the 60s, it's kind of common for vice police squads to target the gay bars, and they would go in because it's illegal to be gay. They would go into these bars and they would trick patrons into like hitting on them or like buying them a drink, or they would flirt with them or something like that. And then they would arrest
Uh,
be like, ha, caught you being gay. You're officially under arrest. And
but
this is a thing that they did. And so this would happen. It was kind of a common thing. And if there was anybody that was at the time considered cross-dressing, so if you were a man and you were wearing women's clothing, that was also generally frowned upon and an arrestable offense. And So this happened kind of a regular night in New York City at the Stonewall Inn, and um, police go into the bar and start arresting people and start kicking them out and hauling them out to the police cars. And while they're arresting people and taking them out, um, so this is I've read a whole lot about this now too, and I've read sort of conflicting stories. So somebody yells, "Why don't you do something?" while they're like kind of getting hauled out to the bar. The person who is saying this is different in different accounts. So I've heard one account that actually says that Marsha P. Johnson, who is kind of the legendary leader of the Stonewall riot, it's been alleged that she shouts, "Why don't you guys do something?" I've also read accounts that it was a different person that yells this, but somebody yells, and then a group of people kind of start to form around the cop car, the cops and there kind of starts to be a crowd, and then they start kind of yelling and shouting at the crowd. And then different accounts of this story also talk about alleged brick throwing. And in a couple different accounts, I have heard that there was a brick thrown at the police officer's car. And again, allegedly, it may have been Marsha P. Johnson who threw that famous brick at the police
Yeah.
squad car, but I'm not going to definitively assert that that is what happened. But somebody threw a brick. Uh,
Was
and
a brick.
What'd you say?
There was a brick.
There
That's
is a
what we
brick,
know.
and there was a shouting, and it may have been Marsha P. Johnson, legendary leader of the Stonewall riot. But
Yes.
what is known is that Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, they're two names that are kind of again like the legendary leaders of this moment. They were there. They were at the Stonewall Inn, and they were some of the ones getting arrested. And I had to educate myself about this too, because a lot of history talks about Stonewall being led by transgender women. So Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, we refer to now as like transgender individuals. But at the time in the 60s, that kind of concept of transgender didn't exist. We just didn't use that word. And so it's now kind of widely understood that they were transgender women, so people who wanted to be identified as women. And at the time, in other accounts I've read, allegedly they are drag queens, and so that's maybe not
Yeah.
the most accurate now. And so anyway, so this riot happens, and rioting happens because this mob forms, and they scare the police officers. Eventually, the police officer, they run back into the bar, and they're kind of hauled up there for a while, and they call for backup. And then there ends up being like hundreds, maybe even like over 1,000 people like in the street on around the Stonewall neighborhood. And there's actual rioting that happens. There's like some burned cars. Nobody dies, but some people are injured, and it happens over the course of 5 solid days. So there's like 2 or 3 like nights in a row of kind of riots happening, and people going out and chanting and marching and just trying to make it be known that they are displeased with the police force and enforcement of these like anti-homosexual laws. And on the after the 5th night, it kind of settles down and there's no more. But even though nothing really happened immediately, what the Stonewall riots did is it got this massive media attention. And because there was 5 days of kind of this like violent thing happening, more and more newspapers and other media and other journalists started to talk about it. And so all across the country now, there is this sort of movement started. And so that old kind of mentality of the former like gay rights advocates of trying to like assimilate and fit in they kind of fell away, and there was way more effort to like stand out and like be heard. Um, and it was people who didn't want to assimilate, that wanted to still fight for their own acceptance. And then a year later in New York City, there's kind of an unofficial pride parade that happens where a group people like congregate on June 28th to celebrate like the Stonewall riot. And people were kind of nervous. Like in New York City, like, oh God, we gotta like watch these people. They're gonna start rioting and breaking things again for this year anniversary. But
Yeah.
it ends up not being that. It ends up just being sort of like a protest, sort of like a march. And in June of 1970 in Los Angeles, the actual city of Los Angeles, they actually approve permits for a group to actually have kind of the first official like pride parade happens in LA in 1970. And so that's when it sort of starts to change. And finally, starting in 1969 and through the 70s, you get um, way more attention and way more media coverage. And what I really like emphasize in class is that change comes with awareness. And so it's kind of
Yeah.
really interesting and parallel to some of the stuff that's going on right now, is that
Yeah.
progress and change happens with the more people that are talking about it and the more people that are aware of injustice that is happening. um,
Exactly.
like a quick little like backtrack too, so off of gay for a second. With the Civil Rights Act of 1964, with the like Black community, and sort of the big Civil Rights Act that led by Martin Luther King, that only
Yeah.
got the attention that it got because of the violence of the Birmingham protests. So in
Yeah.
1963, like that's where some of the big lunch counter sit-ins and some of the other marches happen. And that's where, when you talk about the civil rights marches and movement, where you get those pictures of people getting sprayed with fire hoses and attacked by police dogs, it's
Yeah.
only because those Birmingham protests were so violent, not necessarily because the protesters were being violent, but because the
Yeah.
literal police were, all across the country, in parts and corners of the country that saw these images in newspaper reporting saying like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize it was that bad," is so similar to some of the things that are happening now. And so
Yeah.
in the 70s, when more and more people are advocating for things, it starts to become more and more apparent that like, oh, this is a bad situation. And the other part of like the part of gay acceptance is, the more people that are visible, the more kind of natural or common gay culture becomes. Um, so from the 70s, one of the other questions I got was like, what's the deal with the rainbow? And so, like, a quick history of the rainbow um, is about 10 years after Stonewall. So now there's been, 10 years of marches. And
Yeah.
in San Francisco, let's see, I don't have a date in front of me here. I think it's like 1976. Harvey Milk, he actually is the first openly gay person to get elected as a like government official. He gets part of the San Francisco City Council. Um, in San Francisco, he wants kind of a new symbol to be sort of the symbol of the gay community. And so for a while, for about 10 years, they were using this upside down pink triangle, which is the mark that the Nazis gave the homosexual inmates to wear in the labor and concentration camps. So more people are kind
Yeah.
of aware of, the Jews had to wear the Star of David patch on their clothes to identify
Yeah.
them. And the pink triangle was the symbol that was given to the gay people that were incarcerated. And so it was kind of one of those attempting to sort of reclaim a symbol. And then
Yeah.
it was popular for a while, but it still, I don't know, it didn't pick up. It was like fetch and trying to get made happen, and it didn't happen. Um,
Yeah.
And so anyway,
Okay.
so in 1979, so 10 years after the first like Stonewall riot, there's this guy, this artist, Gilbert Baker, and he decides he wants to make the rainbow be the symbol. He's the artist that Harvey Milk enlists, and so he makes the rainbow flag the symbol of kind of like the gay community. And at first, the colors, they kind of all represented something, but now the rainbow kind of became like this symbol of a spectrum, for all the
Yeah.
different things that LGBT kind of includes. And I mean, and now our symbols literally changing. Like, I don't know if you've seen last year, between last year and this year, there's a lot more intention to include like the black and brown stripe, and
Yeah, I've seen
also,
that.
yeah, have you seen that? And also like the pink and blue, which is the sort of flag symbol for transgender people. So it's kind of this active change that's happening right now. And kind of because of this flag, I think also increases kind of awareness, like even now in 2020. uh, so back in
Yeah,
the late
exactly.
70s, having this flag was kind of this big bright symbol, and the messaging to people was no longer trying to tell people like don't assimilate into society, but rather you want people to come out, because the more people that come out, the more people will be aware of the gay community. And
Yeah.
that's something that I think definitely makes a big difference. One of the things that happens in the 70s is um, PFLAG, so the Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, which is like a parent advocacy group that forms. And this group does a lot to spread awareness and tell families like, oh, you have a gay kid in your family, it's okay, and you can learn to accept them. And that's kind of this messaging that they wanted to promote. So through the 70s, you have little bits of progress being made. And 1973, the American Psychiatric Association removes homosexuality as a mental disorder. And let's see. Oh, Harvey Milk is 1977. Sorry. Um, More and more states, they start to lift their anti-homosexual laws. So in most states, up until 1982, it was still like, don't be gay. And so let's see, Wisconsin becomes the second state. So still in 1982, in 48 states, you can't be gay. Uh, but through that time period, people start talking about these issues more and more. And another kind of like parallel to something that's going on today is it sort of took a really great tragedy, a great public tragedy, for like the federal government to recognize and start to change some things. So in 1998, there's two cases. This guy, James Byrd, and probably the more famous one is Matthew Shepard.
Oh,
They
yeah, yeah.
are, oh, have you heard of that one,
Yeah.
Matthew Shepard?
I believe there's a law named after him, right?
Yes, there is a law named after him. So in 1998, there's these two guys get murdered, and the media attention and the stories behind them becomes widespread, and so everybody kind of hears about Matthew Shepard. So if any, I don't know, students are listening to this, like or teenagers, ask your parents if they remember the Matthew Shepard killing in 1998. It was one of those like big national news stories that everybody heard about, very similarly to the whole George Floyd situation and murder that happened this year. Is like it becomes this situation that blows up into this bigger thing. So unfortunately, because this Matthew Shepard
Yeah.
gets murdered in a really, really awful, awful way. And if you want to, go ahead and Google it. It's a really terrifying and awful story. Um, and so people start talking about it, though. So people start caring, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize it was that bad." Um, and so then, like later, 2009, there's a hate crimes law, like an anti-hate crimes law that gets passed. That's the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd law. Um, Also, shortly after that, and in 2003, So after the murder, before the law gets passed, the Supreme Court in Lawrence versus Texas officially says that gay is officially legal and any state is not allowed to have kind of these anti-homosexual conduct laws anymore. And they're finally determined to be unconstitutional. So that was 2003. We are in 2020 right now. So just 17 years ago, gay was finally legal everywhere. And then kind of more famously in 2015, the United States Supreme Court rules that same-sex marriage is allowed, and so then gay people could legally get married. But all of these changes, they all happen as a result of different people and different ways promoting kind of awareness of all of those things. And that's how change happens. Change happens with the more people that are talking about it, the more people that are aware of things, the more stuff will hopefully ideally get better. And so kind of the big issues right now in the gay community is trying to promote awareness and acceptance for transgender community. And like that's something that I will be honest with you, I didn't fully understand, and I didn't get, I didn't appreciate. And so this is me being honest when I was like, that was something I didn't understand. And I am a part of the gay community. Like I'm a gay man, and the transgender idea was something that was different to me. And I had a couple transgender friends. And so much like the way that me being gay helped people that I know sort of be aware of the gay community and help that wider acceptance, when I met some transgender people and I actually got to know them, first of all, the biggest thing that I can tell you is the first thing that I said when I started this sort of lecture is call anybody whatever they want to, be called, because it's the easiest thing to do. Like, oh, okay, you're a woman, sweet, you're a woman. Like, well, I don't need to debate you about that. And you don't have to get it. And it's not about you, it's not about me, but that's the simplest thing that I can say is the more that we can be aware and accepting of people because their transgenderness is not bothering anybody else, it should be something that we can accommodate and become more aware and learn to accept in society. And especially trans people of color, they often get targeted more frequently and are victims of like hate crimes. And that's, again, the more awareness that there can be, the better hopefully the world will be. And that is sort of the conclusion of my little lecture. So keep talking about things and be aware, be accepting. Call people by whatever pronoun they want to be called. All right, what other questions you got? That was a lot. I'm sorry.
So our first question is what is your opinion on how LGBTQ members are represented in entertainment, just like shows and movies and video games? And is there a character that you feel like most accurately represents members in the community?
So that's really interesting. Like that's another hot topic kind of right now is, gay LGBTQ representation in media. And I was literally just thinking this maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. I was, I don't know, watching TV. I don't know, I rarely watch TV anymore, but there was like, and it wasn't even kind of like a targeted, like queer community kind of network. It was like, I don't know, like NBC or something like that. And there was a commercial and it was like, and it had like a gay couple in it. And that's the first time I've ever seen that. And so definitely gay representation in media is finally kind of way more inclusive, or at least there's an effort to be more inclusive. And there's a lot of different media like that's trying to mainstream it. That's kind of like a big another sort of part of awareness is when things become mainstream is when people start to accept and normalize things that they sort of previously thought, oh gosh, that's too weird, I can't handle that. Um, and I mean, and that's
Yeah.
where like if you talk to probably an older person, like ask your grandparents about how did they feel or how would they have felt if they had seen gay characters like regularly in a movie or a TV show. And if they did see one of those gay characters in a movie or a TV show that is, I don't know, I would argue anything older than 2010 is playing into a really, really exaggerated and potentially, not necessarily, but potentially like negative or derogatory stereotype.
Yeah.
Because those characters obviously existed, but they were sort of there to be this character. And that kind
Yeah.
of negative character in historic media representation is kind of one of those reasons that perpetuates a negative idea. So I feel like I'm rambling a lot now.
Oh no, you're good.
I don't know. Did I answer that question?
Yeah. Uh, Next question.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on corporations using Pride Month in their advertising? Do you feel like the awareness it spreads justifies the pandering in a way?
Yeah. That's kind of like what I was sort of alluding to. I know like there's a kind of a harsh critic in the gay community of like, oh, Bank of America plasters pride flags all over the place, but they don't care about, if you're gay, they just want your money. And while that
Yeah.
may be true, I and also too, I am an individual and I'm like representing my own personal opinion, and I believe that my opinion is shared, and I also recognize that there are people that don't share my opinion. I think that you
Yeah.
need mainstream media, you need mainstream and corporations. Any movement needs the help of powerful allies. So sometimes an ally, they
Exactly.
might not be the best well intentioned ally, but if they are a powerful ally that has influence, they are still a productive part of the movement, I think. And so, the whole like pride becoming this mainstream thing, I'm sort of fortunate like that I'm here to be a part of mainstream pride when I would say
Yeah.
it's only become like this mainstream in the past 5 or 6 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. Like, I would say even certainly like 2010, the mainstreamness, like, pride flags plastered all over the place was not nearly to the extent that it is now in, 2020. Uh, there's
Yeah, for
way
sure.
more promotion of like the pride flag or LGBTQ community as a whole. And I think, yeah, the big businesses are using it as a marketing platform. I am not opposed to that because I think, so to answer your question directly, I believe that it does um, help out it's kind of that awareness of it. Because if I go to middle of nowhere, I don't know, I'm gonna pick a rural state, and I'm not trying to like call anybody out, but like I don't know, Kansas or Nebraska or South Dakota or something. And if I go into a town and that Bank of America has a pride flag in their window, I will feel slightly better about being in that place where it might otherwise be a more bigoted kind of place. I'm kind of curious, like what do you think, or what have you heard about that?
I feel like in this case, it's sort of the idea of that all publicity is good publicity.
Mm-hmm.
If it spreads awareness, it
Yeah,
doesn't really matter the person's ulterior goal as long as it sort of helps.
as long as it's helping. Yeah, it's like maybe their ulterior motive is not the most sincere or the most noble, um,
Yeah.
but I think it is helpful and a move in the right direction.
Yeah. So, uh, do you struggle with your sexuality as a kid/teen? What would you say to was your turning point accepting your sexuality?
Um, yeah, I guess if I'm being really honest, I would say that I did struggle, like, or I was very unsure. Um, Another question I got like for my teaching lesson that I didn't go over was, how do you know if you're gay? um, and the answer that I gave when I was teaching that lesson is like everybody kind of has to find their own journey. And I know that sounds
Yeah.
super duper cheesy, but it's kind of true. Um, every person kind of has their own experience. Some, I will say, some people they know, and I've heard, these stories. It's like, oh, I knew I was gay when I was like really young. And I can honestly tell you, I did not necessarily know. I didn't know. Uh, I I sort of like was in kind of like this questioning phase of like, oh, am I gay? Am I not gay? And the biggest struggle though was even in that, like, I sort of had this self negative talk, like, I don't want to be gay. I will not be gay. And so I would try to convince myself that even if I thought that I might have been, that I didn't have to be, and I would try to like make myself be straight, and that well, eventually that didn't work out for me so well, and I finally just had to come out. um, but
Yes,
also feel like I
I'm
don't know
doing a interview.
what,
It's recording.
who that.
Well, my dad just walked in.
Oh.
Yeah.
um, is I came out really late. Like I'm a 32-year-old man now, and I didn't come out until I was 25. And kind of a big part of that was because when I was younger, like in high school, I was going through this questioning, I didn't know sort of situation, and then I didn't figure it out until quite a bit later. And I think some of the things that are way different now is like the things we just talked about. Like there's way more media representation. There's way more a kind of wider acceptance and
Yeah.
normalizing of that, um, where I can teach this lesson that I just kind of taught to a group of middle school students, and it wasn't a big deal. It was like, oh, well, that was interesting, and
Yeah.
it wasn't a big deal at all. Um, and that tiny little aspect about just a gay teacher talking about gay history, that would, I think, look and sound a lot differently even 15 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, and maybe even 5 or 10. Like we're in that sort of changing transition of
Yeah.
acceptance right now.
Good, so, probably have time for two more
All
questions.
right.
Do you have any experiences where you felt attacked because of your sexuality?
Um, so like I'm really really fortunate in that like I actually mostly haven't. I know that is not the case for a lot of people. Like a lot of people
Yeah.
have to deal with adversity far more regularly than I do. And I know that even still, kids in middle school and high school, they will still have to deal with it sometimes because it's not 100%, widely accepted still. Um, but that's something that hopefully becomes fewer and fewer. And I'm fortunate enough that I've been able to live in a liberal place like Seattle that is widely accepting, and I'm not kind of worried about it. There's there's of course there's been I don't know, a handful of times where a car drives by and will scream faggot out the window, but that just is, I don't even count that as like a, negative. That's just sort of a man, happens every once in a while. And that's unfortunate.
You know, what are you gonna do?
What are you gonna do? I mean, there's still just gonna be some kind of biggity people out there like that are just gonna have some ignorant prejudice. But and
Yeah.
so that is like, that's unfortunate, obviously. But um, other than that, I haven't really felt targeted or discriminated against by anything.
Uh, how did your family members slash friends react to you coming out? Did it change some of their views on homosexuality in any way?
Yeah, like, so again, sort of, I think that the more that an individual connection is made with people, the more that it definitely helps sort of an overall awareness and acceptance. And so my friends and
Yeah.
family were all really accepting. And um I'll say like probably for some of my family members and some of my friends, I think me individually, like when somebody heard like, oh, Marco's gay, well, I guess gay is not so bad then. Um that that is kind of, I think, a mentality and a thought process that goes through a lot of people's minds. And I don't know this for certain. I think maybe even for my extended family, like my aunts and uncles and cousins, um, I don't think they really had any, huge prejudice against anybody who was homosexuality, or maybe they did, and they're just not telling me. That's a possibility too. Um, I don't think they do, but I think that me, like knowing me, I think actually did sort of help a lot of them maybe understand or appreciate when they start hearing about, I don't know, the gay community or gay representation or things like that. Is like they can connect with that because they're like, oh, my nephew's gay or my cousin's gay or something like that. They know someone. Um, and so
Yeah.
all of my friends and family were, really supportive. Um, and again, I'm very, very fortunate in knowing that I had that support, because that is still, even though that was my experience and I have a very fortunate experience, I know that's not the case for everyone still in 2020. But it again, hopefully we're moving in a direction where fewer and fewer people are having to deal with adversity. And I think that's true, but I think there's still a large uh, like a way to improve and bridge that gap.
Yeah. Okay, last question.
Yeah.
How do you feel that Pride parades and Pride Month as a whole has been beneficial for helping people better understand the LGBTQ community?
um yeah, like that's sort of the theme here, everyone. It's awareness, 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 awareness. um I can tell you, like, for me, like, pride and knowing that there's a community, knowing like the gay community. I'm doing quotation fingers, and now you can't see it, but the gay community, knowing that that exists, it's sort of this invitation for other people who are struggling to come out, and people that don't know, or they're in that questioning phase, or they are struggling with their homosexuality, and they don't know how to identify, or if they can come out, they don't feel safe. Knowing that there are so many other people out there, like, that makes, I think, a huge difference for people. And so the more that uh it is represented and it's seen, whether it's in the media or whether it's in a parade or in a pride flag in a Bank of America. I don't know, we're giving lots of publicity to Bank of America right now. I don't even like Bank of America. Anyway, um the more that it is visually seen, it's a cue, it's an invitation to tell people, like, to come out and to join this community. Because for me, like, I was really scared, even though I had a good kind of fortunate experience. I still felt kind of this isolated aloneness, like I didn't have anybody to talk to. I didn't I honestly, and this sounds super silly, like when I was 27 years ago, I wasn't even really that aware of the vastness of the gay community. Like there's a lot of us that you didn't even know they were there.
Yeah,
I don't know. Um
yeah,
I'm kind of curious actually. I have taught this lesson now for 2 years to eighth graders. But what is your perception, Jesse, of like growing up with your family, and I don't know, what you guys saw. I don't know, maybe think back to like fifth grade if you can. So you're like what, 11 years old? So I don't know, for
yeah.
you in the past, what does that make you? Is that 5 years? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
So
what is your perspective? I'm kind of curious.
5 years. So so I grew up in Illinois in like a somewhat rural part close to Chicago.
Uh-huh.
So we didn't really talk about homosexuality or LGBTQ community that much.
Right.
The first instance I can remember was sometime in seventh grade when it, like, came up during science class.
Uh-huh.
Like, to then, I didn't even know, like, that was a possible, like, thing.
Yeah, so you didn't even know that was a thing.
Yeah,
And
and so when we moved here to Seattle, it seemed, like, really a lot more
and
prominent. Like, in the classrooms, they have, like, "This is a safe zone" signs and stuff.
right,
It's, like, kinda popped
we
out.
have those rainbow like posters in our classrooms. So like, yeah,
Yeah,
actually you saw a big difference coming from uh rural or community outside of Chicago. The kind of the presence of, or awareness and open acceptance of, you noticed was more here than in another place.
yeah,
Is that accurate? Yeah. So yeah, so
I'd say that's pretty accurate.
the more people are talking, the more people that are aware, the more mainstream, the more media attention, and accurate media attention that gets created. I think the better for overall acceptance. Where maybe
Yeah,
in a certain number of years, um, like identification as like LGBTQ or gay, it will still be there, but it will be far less of like a big deal. I don't know, it's just kind of saying more of the same. The more in the future, the more awareness that happens, the less of a I don't know, significance identifying as
yeah,
gay or LGBTQ will become. It'll just be like, oh, it's gay. All right, cool. It's like nobody gives it a second thought. Oh, they're transgender. That's cool. Whatever.
yeah,
It's like it's an afterthought and not like a shocking revelation. Like, oh, they're
yeah, it's
transgender. Oh, I don't know if I can be in the same room with them anymore. Hopefully that will be a thing of the past. Okay.
so, thank you, Mr. Manuel, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Jesse. I'm excited to, I don't know, see how this goes. See how it turns out.
So, this has been Redmond Radio, and thanks for listening.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.